What's going on, guys? My name is Johnny Bandon, and I will be the CCNA instructor for this CCNA video series. Thank you for joining us. And in this video, we're going to go over the hardware components of a router and a Cisco router and a Cisco switch. Should be kind of a quick video, but another important one because learning the hardware and the internal components is going to help us learn how the router boots and how it actually brings up its running configuration, the thing that we configure for a router and switch to make sure that it's switching and routing our packets properly. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So we're just going to look at the motherboard of our router and the components. I don't know what series of router this is. It's going to be very similar. Obviously, where you put different components may change based off the different series of router. But a typical Cisco router, it's going to have a CPU which executes the operating system instructions. Same as the computer's CPU, does all that threading. And this is an A+, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but it has a CPU that's going to execute the OS instructions. It has something called ROM, which is read-only memory. That's going to hold the software that's used when a router is powered up. The read-only memory is kind of similar to a BIOS, where it's going to do all of our checks, right? Make sure all of our hardware is authentic, and it does similar to what a BIOS check is on a system, right? It's also going to store what we call the router's bootstrap program, the thing that boots up the router initially, the firmware in our components you see on that motherboard, right? And then we're going to, again, we'll get into the flow of how it boots. This is just going over the components. Then we also have RAM, so random access memory. This is going to store the running configuration, the thing that we configure via CLI. And things like the routing table, the CAM table, also going to be ran in random access memory. And this is volatile, right? So our running configuration, if we configure it and we don't save, we're going to lose all that configuration. Same with our tables, our neighbor adjacency tables, our routing tables, our CAM tables. If the router is turned off, it loses that information or that memory because it's random access memory. It's volatile, right? Then we have NVRAM, non-volatile RAM. This component's going to store the saved running configuration, otherwise known as the startup config, which gets loaded if there is a saved configuration into the running config. This is going over the boot process that we'll go over in our next slide. And then we have the flash. So this is the storage of a router. This is going to be the hard drive of that router or switch. It's going to hold our operating system, and it's going to store the startup config where the NVRAM folder is, right? So kind of look at this chart right here. You kind of see, right, all the components and how they interact. So all of our interfaces here are connected to the system control on the motherboard. RAM's controlling them, the memory that it's learning from there, right? CPU is executing, and then we have our flash, NVRAM. Okay. So now let's go through these boot up steps. So imagine we just turned that router and switch on. First thing it's going to do is called the post test. So it's going to check the inputs and outputs of hardware, just like a BIOS and a PC. Once it does its input output checks of the hardware on the motherboard, it's going to go into read-only memory. It's going to load the bootstrap program in a router. We call this ROM mode, okay? That ROM mode, or that ROM, right? Or the ROM that loads that bootstrap program is then going to search in the flash for an operating system, and it's going to do its checks, right? Hey, do we have an iOS in the flash? No. Are we configured to pull one over the wire via TFTP? No. Is there a USB that we're supposed to pull our iOS from? No. Okay, well, then I have no operating system. I'm going to load into my bootstrap program called the ROM mode. That's if we can't find a good iOS, okay? And in this bootstrap program, we have something called a config register, which is going to tell us how to boot our system. Are we going to boot by by checking for a startup config and then loading that startup config into our running config? Are we going to boot by straight skipping that and jumping straight into the running config, which is going to be blank because we didn't even search for a startup config? So there is something in there called a config register that we'll go over in this course as well. I'll show you how to configure that and how, if you're locked out of your router, you can change this config register so that you can boot directly to the running config to bypass the password you don't know. All right, and then we have the flash. This is going to store the iOS in the NVRAM. And then the NVRAM is that non-volatile random access memory, really just a folder and file location system in that router and switch that stores the running config. So when you save the running config, you save that RAM, you're saving it to NVRAM, which is our startup config file, okay? So then, of course, RAM stores the configuration when the device is running, and really the memory, right? It's the same way I'm using RAM right now to load up Chrome. You're also going to have all your tables, your caches in the RAM as well. So when you save a device and you type in copy running config from privilege mode to startup config, what you're essentially saying is, hey, all the contents running in RAM right now for my configuration, save it to that startup config file that's stored in NVRAM so that if I reboot, I still have this configuration that loads up. Okay, awesome. So again, that's really all we had to go over. In the CCNA exam objectives, you actually don't need to know about this according to the exam objectives. There is nothing on there that says you have to know the boot process. So if we actually see if we can bring them up, CCNA exam objectives. Again, there's really no Control F. It doesn't say you got to know the boot process. Of course, I want to show you because I think it's important, especially if you're trying to get this cert to jump into a network admin role. Yeah, there could be a point where you have to go and do a password recovery on a router. And you got to know the steps of how a router is actually booting up. Maybe you're going to install a router, right? And you got to know, did I save the config from the home office? Oh, hopefully this didn't mess up on the way here. Maybe I got to put a new flash in there. Just so many different things when you're working in a field environment or as that network admin, okay? So awesome. I want to thank everyone for viewing this video and stay tuned for our next video.